Internets, what's happening? Welcome to another episode of Sultans and Sneakers. I'm your host, as always, Mahin Islam, and on today's show, I welcome Ameera Khan. Appreciate you coming through. Ameera is of Bangladeshi origin, from Missouri, transsexual activist, Hafidh of the Qu'ran. So you've memorized the whole Qu'ran. So a lot of different things going on there. I'm really excited for this show. So appreciate you on your vacation. You're visiting family here in Chicago and whatnot. So yeah, tell me a little bit about your background, like where you're from, where you grew up, and all that.
Yeah, assalamu alaikum, may peace be upon you. I'm gonna start with a dua. I get tongue-tied a lot, so I like to think of Prophet Moses, who made a dua when he was going to speak, which is Rabbi shrah li sadri وَيَسِّرْ لِي أَمْرِي وَاحْلُلْ عُقْدَةً مِّن لِسَانِي يَفْقَهُوا قَوْلِي. And so that is a dua that Prophet Moses made. I guess I'll translate. Oh Allah, expand for me my chest, not in a trans way, but like in a way of speaking. وَيَسِّرْ لِي أَمْرِي, make my task easy for me. وَاحْلُلْ عُقْدَةً مِّن لِسَانِي, and untie the knot from my tongue so that they may understand me. So I always like to start with that.
Cool. And then
in the second bit, before you move on, so transsexual is it's kind of an outdated term, right? So some people would take offense at that, and I'm here to not take offense at anything and explain those things.
Sure.
Transgender is what folks in 2020 typically use.
Okay, gotcha. Okay. So, and dua, for those who aren't familiar, is just like a prayer, supplication,
It's
right?
just a prayer, yeah.
Yep. All right, so tell me a bit about your background, like growing up, like, I mean, we get we're both Bangladeshis, right?
Yeah.
So I'm from both Midwestern Bangladeshi.
Yes.
Right. So what does that mean to you, starting off there? Like, what is that, like, identity-wise? What do you, when you think about being Bangladeshi versus, like, because people think they probably meet you, they're like, you're an Indian kid, or a Pakistani kid, right? So what do you think makes it unique to be Bangladeshi first?
Yeah, just riffing off right now.
Can you actually hold your mic closer to the...
Is this good?
Yeah, it's better. Yeah.
All right. I'm a big Coke Studio fan, and there's like a couple of Bengali songs on there, but there's not many.
What's Coke Studio?
Coke Studios, I guess it's sponsored by the Coca-Cola Corporation, but it's like a music show based out of Karachi and parts of another place in India.
Right.
And they do a lot of different songs, but they're almost all in like just languages like Urdu, Hindi, Pashto, Bangla, Arabic, stuff like that. Mm-hmm. So I get excited whenever I hear a Bangla song on there because I'm used to sort of brown culture being dominated by like the Hindi and Urdu speaking folks, right?
Right.
In the masjid and cultural spaces, everywhere.
Sure. Okay. And now, you were born in where? You said Kansas City.
Kansas City, on the Kansas side that Trump actually got right in his tweet about Kansas City Royals.
Chiefs, wasn't it?
Chiefs, yes.
Yeah. So does Kansas City, Kansas get credit for the Chiefs?
No, they don't, because the team is based out of the Missouri side of Kansas City.
Okay.
I was born on the Kansas side.
Is it literally like it's the same city, but they're just a state border running through it?
Yep.
Okay.
St. Louis is the same, except it's with Illinois.
What's the Illinois city?
It's just called East St. Louis.
East St. Louis. Okay.
Yeah.
I got you. Oh, there's like, I work in East Chicago, Indiana.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a little weird, but anyways. So growing up, like, what was your outlook on, like, so what kind of background do your parents have as far as, like, what do they do for work and all that kind of stuff? Because I think Bangladeshis, a lot of us, so I found what's interesting is that Bangladeshis tend to be the more educated out of the South Asian community because a lot of our parents came for, like, academics. They came on fellowship. Like, my dad came on a fellowship back in, like, the early 80s, right? What was your experience like? Tell me maybe family history. How did your parents get here?
Yeah. Oh man, story of my ancestors. Let's go. So dad was here as a graduate student, I believe, in computer science.
Okay.
And so he did that in the 90s, and my mother came here just sort of because she was marrying him, and I talk about dua again, right? Prayer.
Right.
My sister and I, we have always joked that my mother's dua is overpowered. Because I guess she made the offer of citizenship or something, and she won the citizenship lottery, the diversity lottery, and that is how she and my father, by virtue of marriage, became citizens here. So father is well educated, but to be honest, he's had a lot of trouble in sort of like maintaining a job for like long periods of time, and my mom has just not really worked in like professional settings, right? She does a lot of like secretary work. She's done like babysitting, stuff like that, right?
Right.
So my family I kind of grew up knowing that, yeah, we're poor because I can't buy the candy that I want from Walmart, right? And my friends can, right? So it was weird to be like a low income family surrounded by all these high income desis and like trying to like blend in, right? And it wasn't like we weren't like, I never felt the struggle. Me and my sisters, I have two sisters. One just got married this past December. She's 21, and I have a younger one who's 10. And both of us, I think our mom really shielded us from like from feeling that we were inferior because of the poverty, even though like we could see it.
Would you say, was your dad in grad school, like as you were growing up? Okay.
Yeah, well, not as I was growing up. I believe he finished before I grew up, I guess.
Okay.
Before I can remember.
But he was in computer science, so you would usually think computer science would yield you a pretty good income. So.
I would think so, yeah. And like I think what he does is he gets a bunch of like he'll get a job that's like pretty decent, and then he will have a really bad work ethic for it, and then will lose the job within a year.
Gotcha. So that's a revolving door.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I get it. And then as far as Islam goes, and what kind of religious orientation did you grow up with? I guess how do your parents? I guess it starts with the parents, right?
Yeah. My dad was never one to be very strictly religious, but my mother sort of had a sort of spiritual awakening when she came to the U.S. and she really wanted to be connected to her religion.
Right.
And so she got super involved with the masjid community in St. Louis. Yeah. And this masjid is the Dar es Salaam Masjid in St. Louis, West County. If anyone's familiar with it, it's probably the largest masjid in St. Louis, as well as being the one inhabited by like most of like the rich Pakistani, Arab sort of doctor sort of folks.
Right.
And it's very Sunni Orthodox.
Okay.
And like Tablighi Jamaat, our past several imams have like
kind of in that affiliation. Okay.
Yes.
And so you're saying, was this probably like mid-90s before you were born, when she had her awakening?
I think it was after my birth.
After your birth, okay.
Yes, because that's when it clicked for her that she wanted to be a role model for us.
Yeah. Did she identify with like Tabligh Jamaat? Or
not really.
Like where was she getting her knowledge from?
Yeah.
In late 90s at least. Late 90s. This is probably like late 90s, early 2000s, right?
Yeah. So I'll talk about when I'm growing up, right? Because like in probably 2000-ish, I was 5. Weird to say that, but she was connected with like this Orthodox Sunni Muslim, masjid. Sheikh Noor was the imam, who was like Sudani. I think he was Shafi'i technically, but there was a lot of like Hanafi influence in the masjid, and so I grew up learning a lot of both of them. And like she would drive like half an hour from our house in North County all the way to the masjid to like attend these like halaqas, which is just like talks about God, right? Right. And I would be like that 5-year-old kid sitting in the corner playing on the Game Boy, right? And diffusing a lot of that knowledge, because my mom would listen to these halaqas like she would listen in the car, driving back and forth. We would listen to like, these Yasser Qadi and Al-Awlaki back when he wasn't problematic, right? Lectures and all of these things. So I grew up with that sort of view on Islam, like very Sunni, Tablighi Orthodox, and then later on in my life, she grew closer and closer to like sort of a Salafi branch that sort of had issues with that masjid, like the Sunni Orthodoxy, right? So they're still Sunni, but like they were just like, we don't believe in madhabs and we want things to be like back to, you know, sort of Salafi.
So you're talking like essentially, so if we're looking
this
at
is
time,
a strain of orthodoxy within the orthodoxy.
yeah. So you got 5 years in, you're looking at like your mom's, and I remember Yasser Qadi 2001, because that's kind of where I started learning about some of the Islamic basics through his old CDs. When I was a kid, not quite as young as 5, but I want to say like maybe like 9, 10 years old, the Bangladeshis in Columbus would have like these halakas at people's houses. And there would be like this Turkish guy dude showing up, talking for like 2 hours, and we'd be bored to death. And we'd be like, when we can go upstairs and play Nintendo.
Yes.
Like, we were locked in. I don't remember a thing. I just remember he would just go on for like 2 hours.
Yeah.
Right? So would you say you kind of heard some, like, is it something your mom would like communicate to you, or just something as you were listening, sitting in the back, you would like pick up stuff while you're like listening to the game?
I feel like I got more out of those than my mom in terms of like intellectual understanding of like how Sharia works, for example, or like, you know, just like tidbits of gold from the Sunnah of the Prophet and the prophets and the Hadith and everything.
Right.
So my mom definitely went there, I think, more for the community. And if I may delve in a little bit, I'm a big astrology nerd, and she has like 6 planets in air signs, so it makes sense to me to be like, oh, she goes in there and like all of the information just comes in and like blows and expands her mind, but she doesn't really like get it. But she likes the feeling of getting it, so I'm like, that's fine, right?
Well, she probably thinks that's like shirk, right?
Oh yeah. Oh no. I had to sneak and get her like, oh mom, when were you born? I'm just curious, right? And then I like put it in the calculator. Right?
Shirk being like, you know, a kind of like, it's something you hear about when you're within the Salafi dawah. That's something when you learn creed, you're gonna learn that like the idea. I think the way Yasser Qadi used to, I don't know how he defines it now, but he used to define shirk as giving the rights of God to other than God, and the idea of giving like astrology is like some other like, you know. So I've never delved into it. It's something I learned about 15 years ago, and I've kind of just like done my own thing since. But anyway, so let's fast. So your mom now, but is she saying you started going more towards like a more Salafi understanding, because those cats aren't even down with the Yasser Qadi no more.
Yeah.
So Al-Waqi freaking went off the deep end.
Yes.
Right, and then. We don't know. He was popular. He was like, everybody had his CD set, right? And Yasser Qadi, I met him in 2005. Now he's like considered like
celebrity sheikh
or heretic by some people. You know, I've got a relationship with him still. I mean, I really don't have an issue. You know, I don't have an issue with much of what he's got to say, to be honest. I like to see that growth personally, right? I've had similar kinds of growth to him. We almost have like parallel paths in a way, right? So I definitely respect that. So can you talk a little bit about your mom's orientation, or like when did that start to the more Salafi side?
I didn't really notice it.
Really?
I couldn't tell you that. It was kind of a smooth, natural transition, because she always wanted to be like the most like spiritual that she could be, and Salafis were really doing the most, and they still are. And
as far as like rituals,
as far as like that is wrong and this is the actual way, and like having the, do you get what I'm saying?
Legal, like very legalistic, possibly. Is that I don't know if that's the right word.
I don't think legalistic is the word. It's more of just like saying that we have our shit together and you don't, and they kind of have that affect for a lot of other Muslim sects, and so she was really trying to pursue that a lot more because she wants to be a real Muslim. So maybe it just like stems from a place of like insecurity, or maybe it stems from a place of like, I want to really like
do it the authentic way,
do what God wants me to do, whatever that means, and I don't know what that means, right? So I will look for those spaces. So it was really kind of natural when she went into it.
Now, talk to me a little bit about your when you started memorizing the Quran.
That was so this began 2005, I would say, so summer of 2005. I began attending a full-time Hafidh class in St. Louis. Hafidh Harun is our teacher.
Can you, by the way, hold it a little? You're like missing.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay.
You got it. All right. I was like, that's why I was like playing. You just hold it right, like how I'm holding it. You're good.
Yeah, so we had a teacher, Hafidh Harun, and he would teach me and I want to say like 10 other kids, right, at the time. We call ourselves like the first batch of Hafidh, right, that graduated from what eventually became the Qu'ran Academy in St. Louis. So it would basically be Monday through Friday, 8 to 6 p.m. in the masjid, memorizing Quran. And you got a lunch break and a prayer break, and we'll do bathroom breaks, and that's it. Basically, it was pretty rigorous. Honestly, I'm very surprised that I made it through that.
Did you get your ass beat?
I did.
I asked, like, you see that movie Muslim? Remember that movie? You see that movie Muslim from like a few years back?
No.
You didn't see, who was in that movie, man? I mean, who was in that movie?
My mind went straight to Man Like Mubin, but that's good.
Sorry. No, who's the movie? I can't remember the actors. It probably came out like 2010, I want to say. Mm-hmm. And it was a kid, and this kid was getting beat. Like,
yeah, we got beat. It was literal like abuse. Like after we graduated is when the aunties started catching on. Like my generation of Hafidh, right? We graduated, and the aunties were like, "You can't do this. Like this is not okay." And so now the kids who are in the Quran, right? They have it a lot easier. But no, Hafidh, you know those like rehals, right? The wooden Quran stands.
Yeah.
He broke one of those on a classmate's back.
Yikes.
Yeah, and he knew that he didn't have his homework ready that day, so he wore like 3 belts that day. And so I was like, "Are you okay?" Afterwards to him, and he's like, "Yeah, it didn't even hurt. I was prepared."
Right.
Just like,
dang. But like, does that start affecting your perception of the religion, or do you not think, or you just think that's like just what we do?
That affected, I think, other aspects, because in my head I've always had a very sort of stark distinction between what is considered culture and what is considered culture and what is considered religion. Yeah. And that distinction I feel like is a super popular one to make in just like Muslim circles who want to be like, this is religion but that's culture, so this is okay and that's not. Yeah. I'm learning to like sort of, what's the word?
Differentiate.
Deconstruct that a little bit, because I think there's a lot of aspects of where like culture becomes religion and religion becomes culture, and people don't really notice when that happens. I can give a historical backing for that, but in any case, no, I think that environment more imposed this sense of toxic masculinity onto me that I didn't like at all, right? But I was trying to strive to, right? Because it's like if your teacher is your bully, like you have to suck up to that. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. In a way, and it's just like, okay, if this is what's normalized, then I have to be like, oh, if I'm getting beat up, it's my fault, first of all. So like victim blaming myself. Yeah. But then also to be like, how can I like make myself look tougher so I can avoid getting hit more?
And you're like 19 years old at the time?
This is 5th grade. So I finished Quran on March 3rd, 2009 at the age of 13. So it's probably like 11.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did you ever tell your parents, your mom or dad, that you were getting beat at Quran school?
Like kind of this. They knew, and they were just like, "That's because you didn't do your homework." You know what I'm saying? Like
Bangladesh, you're getting beat too. Right?
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
So all of these teachers, they were. I mean, all of the parents of the students were just like, "That's what it comes with in the beginning." And then eventually they were like, "Okay, this is bad long term, right?" Yeah. I still actually this is private, but the kids used to bully me by like taking like their fingers and like poking you in the ribs. Mm-hmm. And so now whenever anyone touches me like right here, I have this automatic reflex. My hand will just go out and slap them, no matter who or what it is. Right. I accidentally slapped an uncle making wudu once who accidentally poked me with his elbow. I like hit my grandma and I was like, sorry. Right. But
okay. So now
anyway, yeah.
So you finished the Quran, you're like starting to, I remember in the other episode I heard you, the other podcast I heard you a little bit of your backstory, where you start to learn a bit more about Islam. All right, we're gonna cut to the good stuff right now. All right, all right. So you realized you're in school. Now, how old were you when you realized? So first of all, just for context, Ameera used to be Ameer, right? Okay. So you were, just describe it. I don't want to like put words in your mouth.
Yeah. So the process of self-discovery is an iterative one. So, and like people talk about like coming out of the closet as being like a one-time thing, but really when you like talk to a lot more folks with like more follow-up, they're like, you come out of the closet multiple times in different spaces, right?
Yeah.
And it's sort of like over and over again, I'm coming out, but I'm also developing and growing my own identity. So, I finished Hafidh. I finished memorizing the Qu'ran. I had led like Tarawih prayers and stuff at different masajid around the St. Louis area for a couple of years. I was in high school, and then in my junior and senior year, I fell mad head over heels in love with a guy, and I didn't know what was happening, and I was just like, I'm not in love. I just really, really like him. And then he's like, Ameer, you're gay. I was like, no, you're not. No, I'm not.
No, you told him? Like, who told you that conversation?
He noticed. I was like,
were you like eyeing him or something? Like how? Like I guess I'm trying to understand.
I was just hanging out with him a lot, right. And like I was probably like giving him more eye contact or something than he wanted. You know, like we were just hanging out, and he's just like, "Where'd you come from? Sure, you can hang out. You're okay." And then after a while, he's like, "Wait, you really like me, don't you?" I was like, "No, you don't." He's like, "Yeah, you do. You're gay." And I was like, "No, I'm not." And so then I went home and I was like thinking about it. And I was like, "Oh shoot, like I am gay."
Okay, so before this, had you ever liked girls?
Only like theoretically, if that makes sense. I would like see women, I'd be like, I appreciate that, you know, like this one is tall or this one has like a nice like cheekbones or whatever it is, you know what I'm saying? But it wasn't really like a sexual or like a romantic or a full body attraction, right? It was very much this like idea of like really old ass chivalry, right? Like this Muslim chivalry, man macho ideal of like, I want to marry them. But like, there's like 0 to 100 with no in between. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so there was no substance in between. But this was the first like attraction that I actually had been like, this is real substance that I'm feeling. Like I've never felt like this for any girl before.
Now, when you're a junior in high school, that's like 16, roughly. Does that sound about right?
16, 17. 18.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, did you find it unusual that you never had attraction for anybody up in that point, or but maybe you just didn't realize? Because you know when you're like freaking like 13. I mean, listen, you know, raw here.
Hormones.
When I was in 8th grade, yeah, I'm 13. Your hormones are out of control. It's like freaking jizz in your bed twice a week, right? It's like, you know, once you know wet dreams start kicking in, like,
yeah,
you know, and it wasn't, and it's really fleeting. It's not like so I remember like, man, it was like 7th, 8th grade. I'd be like walking through school, and it's like, that girl's cute, you know, and then you're like, your mind just starts going places too, right?
Yeah.
You get what I'm saying?
I never got that though.
Okay.
Like as all, you know, kids end up doing, I ended up watching like porn, and I tried to always keep it on the DL, and I'd always be like super sorrowful and like do this toba afterwards, right? And then go back and do it and then do it again. Toba being repentance, right?
Right. Like porn as far as like normal like...
No, I tried doing heterosexual porn, and it felt ugly. I was like, why are they treating the women like that? I can't handle this. No. Okay. And so I never watched like straight porn because it really turned me off, and I'd only watch gay men basically have gay sex in porn, and I was telling myself that I'm not gay, I just don't like seeing women treated that way. But then, like, so that's the sexual part, and then the romantic part was me feeling like all of these emotions for this one guy, and I was like, holy crap, like, yeah. You know, I put 2 and 2 together, and I was like, I guess I am gay, right?
Now, I assume he wasn't gay?
Not then.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Not until later.
Okay.
Until when it's too late for me. But
Gotcha. Okay. So then, what happens next for you? Like, how do you? I guess how are you processing that? Because, listen, you're Muslim, you're Hafidh at the time.
Yeah.
And you realize you're gay. You have same-sex inclinations. How do you deal with that?
Yeah. So first of all, I knew that I couldn't tell anyone, because if I did, I would lose my position of being of leading prayers in masajid in St. Louis, and people would no longer respect me, and also no one would understand or empathize with that. So I internalized that, and I didn't share that with anyone, because I know what the stigma is. I'm not an idiot, right? I can read the room. So so that ended up being really, really unhealthy in terms of mental health, right? And so I was I went through the whole 5 stages of grief in terms of, bargaining and be like, well, can I just not, and then actual anger, and I have memories of sitting on my jainamas in my room, right, my prayer rug, and crying and yelling at Allah, being like, why did you make me this way? If you say yourself in the Quran, La yukallifu Allahu nafsan illa wasaha, we do not burden a soul with more than it can bear. So why are you burdening me with something that literally nobody else in my friend circle has been burdened with? Why me? And I was so mad. I was so exhausted and sad and angry, and all of those emotions that really just is part of the grieving process, right? And I didn't attempt suicide, but I still have self-harming scars down here on my arms and stuff, and I had definitely contemplated many times suicide, because it was not a good place, and I couldn't share. There was no outlet for this, right? Besides on my prayer rug.
Right.
So it was a really, really shitty time. What happened was that I eventually had a class. I was still an overachiever high school student this whole time, getting, mostly A's and everything.
Right.
So no one knows that anything's wrong, right?
Yeah. By the way, before we get too off, you mentioned the verse of the Quran where it says God does not burden the soul more than it can bear. Because I've heard people say that, well, the understanding I've at least received is sometimes when you're being tested, that you're being stretched. Right? You can handle it, but you may not realize it. You follow what I'm saying?
Yeah.
For example, you see, I'm a parent, right?
Yeah.
And you see parents who are tested with death of young children, right? And you see them, and I'm I don't know how they handle it,
right?
But they do, right? You get what I'm saying? And when you speak with them, you're blown away. How do you deal with that? And it's my thing is all right, well, I'm not ready. I don't think I could handle it. However, it's I also don't know that.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Right.
Because did that cross your mind? Hey, I'm being tested right now in this way, but maybe there's something beyond it.
I'm getting to that.
Okay.
So overachiever Ameera,
right,
goes, and I'm not even taking AP classes, and I'm doing this dual enrollment thing, right?
Sure.
So I'm taking 4 classes at my university, and then driving over to a community college and taking classes there.
This is after high school graduation?
This is during high school.
It's like that post-secondary kind of PSEOP they used to call it in Ohio. Post-secondary enrollment. For example, you run out of I remember in Columbus when I went to high school, I finished all my calculus at high school by my junior year.
Yes.
I went to Ohio State for my calc.
That's exactly what it is.
Okay.
So I was doing this, and I was going to these community college classes.
Right.
So it turns out that I had a friend who was enrolled in the exact same class as me.
Yep.
And so we were like, okay, bet, let's carpool, right? And this friend of mine, we would basically just drive there, and we weren't even that close. We were more acquaintances, yeah. And then we grew close over going to this class together because we talked about, of all things, My Little Pony. I think it was for me, I viewed it as an outlet for my femininity in some way. He just liked it, you know what I'm saying? And so we chatted, and like this is sort of like something that we bonded over, and because of that bonding, I was able to like be like, okay, this is someone who I can trust, right? And then I eventually came out to him because I couldn't handle like bearing this secret and walking around with it, you know? It's just a lot of pressure. So I came out to him, and we sort of talked through that. And what I did come to the conclusion after all of this chatting was, yeah, like this is my test essentially, to be tested with gayness, right? And to resist that temptation as I live, right? And just to live celibate, if that's what it means, right? And so that was like sort of where I had come to at that point. And that is not a view that I still agree with, and I'll get to that inshallah later on.
Sure.
But at the time, that was the closest thing to resolution that I could grapple onto, and I think in that sense, I legitimately say that he saved my life. And he just got married recently, and I'm very happy for him.
Right.
And I'm telling him, I'm going to tell this story at your wedding if you let me speak in front of a bunch of aunties.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, there is a problem with the Muslim community as far as, you know, people like how you want to go. Because, like, I mean, my understanding from talking to people like yourself is that, you know, so there's the whole nature versus nurture and all that stuff. But like, listen, I have no reason to believe that somebody who grows up in a conservative Muslim family would want, as a male, to like boys.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
I tried everything.
You know what I'm saying?
You know.
So I think that there is that aspect, right? And so there's a few things. You know, the issue of sexuality and sexual identity is something that, as far as I know, seems to be more like a postmodern construct, right? Mm-hmm. Like being gay, like Islamically, it's not like the issue isn't being gay or heterosexual or straight is even like has certain connotations to it, right? It implies relation dependent on a nuclear family, which is again a postmodern kind of thing, right? It's what we sexuality wise, right? We have like, all right, you have sex, and there's constraints around that, right? But generally, it's considered to be like, well, it's a private thing, right? Because it's not like there's never been same-sex oriented Muslims in our history. Obviously,
not.
Right?
Yeah.
You know, so I think it's part of the thing where it's people assume we've taken something out of like the fundamentalist Christian playbook and imposed that and called it like orthodoxy. Mm-hmm. Okay, because being gay, there's no such thing as far as I have researched, as far as like meaning that until you've actually started having sex with like men. Mm-hmm. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Because we're not judged on our intentions or inclinations. Like, yeah. So for example,
it's a matter of the action as opposed to the identity.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
So I spoke to a Christian pastor, like, I remember a few years back, and this guy was a guy I used to work with, and he, you know, sometimes he would double as a pastor, and he would be like, no, having the thought is a sin. And I was like, well, that's not what we believe.
That's not what we believe.
You know, but I think we've superimposed that. So you have rhetoric who people say being gay is haram.
Yeah.
I'm like, well, no, it's not, because we don't have such a thing as identity.
Right.
Like, that identity does not even exist. Like, it doesn't exist in the Sharia. Like, you would make the argument like, okay, doing this act is a sin, like any other sin, and human beings, we commit sins, right? So I think that's where I feel like the community has like dropped the ball in a way. Because the mosque is supposed to be a place where if you're struggling with something that's a spiritual spot, you're supposed to go there.
Yeah.
And deal with it, and it's not, I'm not even sure about like, and I'm not even talking about like, oh, pray the gay away. I'm just like, hey, listen,
just
maybe
for
you'll
anything,
deal with it, right? Yeah,
like that's why all these masjids try to do all of the things, you know, have the basketball tournaments and then do the camping trips, and then also have the halaqas, and then also I think in my ideal world would be a place of like of distributing, you know, like sadaqah to people who need it, you know. And just like giving free food, like the Sikhs do that better than we do, I think. But yeah.
I mean, we're 14, 15, 16 years old. Mm-hmm. Let's say, for example, like I was thinking about this the other day, like probably 30% of my friends had sex with girls before, like either high school or college, before they were married, right? Not that they didn't believe it was like, here's the thing, they didn't say it was like, well, it's okay. Like, it's something we just did. It's like, man, it just happens. We're not perfect people, right? Right? Hey, I mean, listen, you're 13, 14 years old. Like, I got married when I was 27, right? So, there's still like a period of celibacy for like 13 years. And that sucks. I mean, you know what I'm saying? Right? Your classmates, I mean, see, you're in a different generation than me. When I was in high school, at least it was more low key. Yeah. Pretty much I think in high school everyone's smashing now. Right? I don't know. You know what I'm saying? But
I feel like even back then.
Yeah. So like it was a little bit more like under the table in the 90s when I graduated high school. Yeah. But it was I think it was still happening. But you would like definitely back in college for sure. I mean, because like you're away from parents and all that stuff. But did you ever think like, you know what, I'm just gonna have sex with dudes? And like just cover it up and just move on. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like everyone's got, some people have their vices.
I didn't do it like that because I have always been and continue to be very committed to what I understand is spirituality and connection with Allah and the divine. Okay. So I didn't want to divorce that idea of this is just an action from my self-flagellation and like this idea of self-worth, right? So I really took that to heart, and eventually when I came to that conclusion with us, my friend at the time, I went to your
friend is Muslim or not?
My friend is Muslim, right? Okay. If he wasn't Muslim, we couldn't have connected like that because I needed someone Muslim to understand that. Right? Yeah. Also speaking to the importance of Muslim therapists, right? But I went to college as a freshman, and then 4 years of undergrad. The first 1.5, I was very much closeted. Oh Lord, I'm saying this out loud. I came out of the closet after tripping on LSD with the guy who I was dating at the time, right? Kind of dating, kind of like asking him for math advice. Right. And so I came out of the closet then, and then I was like, this is really freeing. This is something that is, I guess, important to me. And so then when I talk about coming out in iterations, that's like the first time when I like came out to anyone that I was like gay outside of my friend, right? Right. And then later on that semester, before it finished, I wrote a spoken word piece, a poem. I performed the spoken word piece at this MSA competition in Knoxville, Tennessee, and came out of the closet on stage with over 100 Muslims in attendance. Yeah. And that was, first of all, it was nerve-wracking as heck. Second of all, I got a very, very mixed reaction from the people, right? Some of the people were like, thank you so much for saying that. People really need to talk about this more in the Muslim community. It's so stigmatized. Some people were posting like official apologies on behalf of the MSA for allowing me to perform this poetry piece, all of these things. I still want third place, but what ended up happening was one person came up to me after that and was like, thank you so much for doing that. I really appreciated it, and if you would like, I can connect you to this friend of mine who is like cool and inclusive of LGBTQ people. And I was like, sure, what do I have to lose, right? Like, it's really out there. She connected me with this Bengali in New York, actually, whose name is Shahana Hanif, if you know that name. She is the first Bengali person to run for city councilwoman of Queens.
Okay.
And so, but back then she was just a student, I guess. And so she was like, yeah, cool, like, welcome. Let me add you to this group. I was added to a Facebook group called Radical Muslims, tongue-in-cheek, right?
Right.
There's like a guy, like an Arab Saudi guy, you know, on a skateboard with a rainbow background as the icon. And so, added me there, and that was basically the first space. It was online, it was digital, where I found other queer Muslims, right? And that was so powerful for me, and that really helped me stabilize, like, throughout, like, after that, because at that point I was totally out of the closet, right, as a gay man at the time, but now I'm like, there are other gay Muslims in the world. I'm not the only one, right? And I'm not the only one who cares about the deen still, right? And so that was just a really important space for me.
Okay, how did you derive your understanding? Like, I guess when you looked at, you know, homosexuality or same-sex attraction or sex in terms of religion, how did you learn about that? I guess what was your because, like, in a group like that, for example, I'm always curious, like, what's the thought process on you know, like, what's going on? Is it something that, like, hey, we're all struggling with this, or is it something like what exactly, like, what's, because I think you know where people have the fine line, right? Like, we all have struggles, we all commit mistakes, we all have sins, right? But then people have a problem with, like, for example, like like Sunni Orthodoxy would have a problem with like the queer Muslim, LGBT Muslim, without speaking to anybody, but in general, they would assume that these people are trying to not normalize is the right word, but make permissible, like, same sex.
Yuhallu haram. Right?
Yeah, right. Make halal. Make halal what God made haram.
Right.
Impermissible, right?
Yeah.
So, what's the framework you're operating? I imagine part of it is just like, hey, we're just we just are ostracized from our community. We have no one else to rely on. People need community, so I can relate to these people, right? I assume that's where it starts from.
Yeah. I needed the community first and foremost because I thought I was the only one, right?
Okay.
So, period, just for mental health, no sharia, no nothing, I needed the community.
Right.
I found them, alhamdulillah. Now, these people are very different in how they approach the deen, right? Some of these folks were like, I really believe that the Sunni orthodoxy is still the truth, and I don't know how to reconcile this, but I'm glad that I have friends as I move on that journey, right?
Right.
And my choice of reconciliation is celibacy. There are other people who are like a lot more open, who are like, no, like, I think that, like, sexuality is a private thing, and like, God doesn't care about it, right? And all of these things. And so I'm like trying to, like, be like, where do I fit in? I'm just like, I don't want to just throw Sharia away with the wind, you know what I'm saying? Because I believe that there's a lot of benefit to it. Even still, like, earlier today I was reading and studying an Islamic finance course because I'm interested in the wisdom that Sharia has for guiding humanity.
Right.
So I was like thinking, I was like, well, what am I supposed to do? And some other people, like, you know, just discussions just going on. Someone was like, have you heard of this book, Homosexuality in Islam? I was like, no, I haven't. Let me look it up. Found the book online, I downloaded it, and that book was the bridge I needed to move from like, this is a sin and I need to live celibate, to be like, no, the basis of the basis of a Shari'i injunction of making homosexual acts haram is flawed because the interpretation of the story of people of Lut is flawed, and the hadith and the accompanying hadith and like sort of in Sharia frameworks and stuff, and like how even like scholars at the time, like Ibn Hazm, spoke out about that. Right?
Okay, so let me ask you a little bit on that. So
Yeah.
I haven't read the book, right? I've heard of the book, by Scott Kugel.
Yes.
Right. Okay. So the idea, I guess, the idea is that like, so first when I always look at when I'm reading a book or I'm entering a subject, because do you think when you're exploring the book, you sound that you're coming across as someone who you want to honor God and respect the law of God, right? And so the idea, like I posited earlier, like, hey, just have sex with dudes and just make tawbah kind of thing, right? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I'm sure nobody ever actually told you that back then, did they? I was like, hey,
no one said that, but it wouldn't fly with me as a person who is deeply committed to like being a truthful human.
But do you also understand that like we all make mistakes? Like,
absolutely.
There's other things that we do that are also sinful, continuously, right?
Yes.
So the religion is a religion of repentance, and that's why we do istighfar and that kind of thing, right? So when you're exploring this text, like, did you ever feel at a time that you're like, I'm looking for confirmation bias? Or
I was very intentionally trying to disprove myself, right?
Okay.
To be like, I'm not trying to cherry pick. Every time I read that book, like every page, I was like, I'm not cherry picking. I'm not going to cherry pick. I need to be convinced.
Right.
Because I'm not going to make halal what is haram.
Right.
And that book convinced me.
Okay, so what is Kugel's like main argument, you would say? Like, how would you describe that?
Yeah. It's made in several parts. But and I also think that some of the things that he says about bisexual now, as in 2020, I look back and I'm like, some of the things he said about like bisexual folks and like transgender folks are valuable, but like need a little bit of adjustment. But his textual analysis of the Quranic ayahs that had always been quoted against gay folks was very good, and that's what I needed, because I was like, yes, all of this, but like, everyone is saying Qawmi Lut, right? Yeah. I need to talk about Qawmi Lut. So then he goes, and there's a chapter on Qawmi Lut, right? And all of the verses that are used. And me, having memorized the Quran, I know exactly what verses he's talking about.
Right.
I know exactly like the makharij, what's the word? The masdar. If you know like Arabic.
The grammar.
I know the grammar. I know the etymology and like the sort of conjugations of all of these words that he's talking about, right? And so he's like, okay, every single ayah. He goes by like every single ayah and being like, okay, right? You approach men instead of women. You are a people who are jahil, who are ignorant.
Right.
And so basically he looks at all of these texts and all of these verses, and makes the case for saying, the sin of the people of Lut was not consensual homosexual sexual acts. It was very much rape. Okay. And it was non-consensual sex that happened to the homosexual. And I'm like, okay, how do you make that argument, right? And so he talks about like in like context, right? You need context to have anything. Mufassir al-Quran bil Quran, right? You understand the Quran with other parts of the Quran. Right. And so every time that you talk about the people of Lut, right? It is so I'm gonna try to quote a bit of my give me a sec. Sorry, I'm like racking my brain, but damn it, I just had it. I'm sorry. I'm trying to avoid cussing, but it's fine. I cuss all the time. But there are verses essentially that say وَجَاءَ أَهْلُ الْمَدِينَةِ يَسْتَبْشِرُونَ, right? Is one ayah that is talking about like the people of Lut, where they come and like qala, and they're very happy, they're jubilant, they're excited, right? They're like laughing and stuff like this. And then قال إن هؤلاء ضيفي فلا تفتحون. And then Lut says to them, these are my guests, right? These angels that are coming here, these that are men, they are my guests. فلا تفتحون. So do not dishonor them.
Right.
واتقوا الله ولا تخزون. Fear Allah and do not, do not dishonor me, right?
Right.
And so that is implying right there that this mob of people, their intention was not to be like, hey, how are you doing? Would you like to have sex? It's a mob. You know what I'm saying? And the history and other parts of the text say that, like, these are people who like steal from travelers, you know what I'm saying?
Right.
Like, they are inhospitable to guests, right? And this is one example where Lut is saying, you don't be inhospitable to my guests.
Right.
Right? Because part of their inhospitality, on top of like just basic food, water, shelter, is this rape, right? And this was a known thing of the people of Lut. And that's why, like, Allah doesn't talk about that directly and say like this. I don't know if there's a word rape in Arabic and Fusha Arabic, you know what I'm saying?
Right.
So Allah talks about this in a way that befits, Allah's language, which is, like you are approaching men instead of women, right?
Right.
And so that felt like a key piece of context, right? And everyone is like, yes, the people of Lut did do that, but also gay sex is bad. But the thing is, when you put those pieces together and be like, it's a mob, they are not asking permission, they're going to deface or de-honor someone, their intention is not consensual, their intention is rape. And that is also historically supported by like understanding, like other aspects of their history. Does that make sense?
It does a little bit.
I feel like I'm talking in circles.
The first question I would always ask is like, when you look at a scholar, so for example, in Islamic law, I follow a madhab of Imam Malik.
Sure.
Right? And the reason I follow madhab Imam Malik is his principle of the people of Medina.
Okay.
Right? Because to me, it's like, okay, I'm Muslim, so that means that I submit to the will of God.
Yeah.
Right? And I do it through the conduit, the messengership of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Right? And now it's like, how do I understand that? Like what? And then so, and I look for I'm pretty traditional in that sense. So Malik, because I'm like, all right, there's all these companions. The companions do the Prophet the best, etc. And you have the chain, the golden chain, which is Malik to Nafi to Ibn Umar to the Prophet. Right? Ibn Umar being the companion. Yeah, companion who was young. He absorbed a lot. He was known for being like absorbing a lot of the Sunnah, etc. All right. So with Kugel, I would ask like, what is his? Because the other thing we learn from scholars, right? So the other thing is, it's like, okay, the Hadith says that the scholars are the inheritors of the Prophet. So that's why we have a living tradition that kind of like tells, and that's what makes it. That's where that's how you avoid a free for all.
Yes.
Right. Mm-hmm. So I guess I would ask, like, what would Kugel's own epistemology be to like, because now what's happening, and that's what the question is, like, all right, well, he's coming up with this exegesis of these verses that historically haven't, like, and we can talk a little bit about Ibn Hazm and all that, and some of this, because I've heard Ibn Hazm quoted in that realm before, and so, but what's your take on that? Like, how did you digest like that question of like, okay, who's Kugel, and why is, like, not only the book, but why is he qualified to go here when no one else has? Yeah,
no, I definitely thought about that a lot. And I was like, who is this Kugel guy? You know what I'm saying? At that point, I was kind of like understanding this from a little bit of the idea that, excuse me, the idea that we take wisdom from our scholars and our predecessors, but the Quran needs to be interpreted like by those with knowledge, but also has value and wisdom to those who read it straight from the heart, right? And so that's maybe a little bit of a Sufi concept, but in terms of like direct interaction and experience, right? But I have always believed that, like, even outside of any of like the realm of LGBTQ, I've always been interested in like interfaith. And I was even president of the Interfaith Alliance at one point at St. Louis University, right?
Sure.
But because I think that there's a lot of these tenets that are commonly shared between different faiths and also can be taken and implemented and make me deeper in my own faith.
Right.
So when I looked at this question of like, who is this Google guy, right? That was a big thing that came for me to be like, what he's saying is not wrong, though, right? And then at that point, I felt like two equally valid sides. Because one...
But I guess that's the question about who he is, though.
Right. And, like, I wouldn't call him min al-ulama, right? I would say that he knows his stuff, though.
Okay.
And he could be considered within ulama. But, so this was kind of like a post facto thing, because I was looking at, and I was like, his arguments make perfect sense. It sounds like there's pieces of context missing systemically that have led to a incorrect argument. Right. And then also I'm like, but the establishment is on the other side. And how do I just go against the establishment? I'm not that kind of person. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So I kind of sat with both of those arguments in my mind as I just sort of moved on in life, and I let him marinate for a little bit. Right. And I didn't really take a side. Yeah. And then later on, I learned more about because Black Lives Matter occurred, like the shooting of Michael Brown occurred in Ferguson, 20 minutes away from St. Louis University. Sure. And so that started a lot of talk about like race and like systemic racism as opposed to like individual racism. And I was like learning all of these things. I was like, oh wow, right? And then I learned also about systemic patriarchy. And then when I understood that, and then I came back and looked at the book, there was talk of systemic patriarchy as well, in terms of like who gets to be considered an alim, right? Who gets to have like a sanad and stuff like that. And so that was sort of the other part of the argument that made me be like, is a misinterpretation being passed down, right? And being gatekept from what the actual, or gatekeeping what the actual interpretation is. And so that was sort of the thing that pushed me to be like that plus the personal experience, right? The fact that I'm feeling like I'm gay and I cannot change this, and this is not necessarily a burden on me the way that I envisioned it to be, right? And knowing that like I deserve to have sex, you know, like as a human being, we're sexual beings, right? Like repressing that is inhuman in a way, right? And which is why, you know, marriage is so important, right? And having like an outlet for that and everything. And so it was sort of like a combination of all of these factors that led me to be like, okay, I no longer think of my gayness and later on my transness like as a sin, right? Right.
So I think that as I'm kind of like unpacking this a little bit. Yeah. It seems like a lot. So going back to what the community, how we approach people like yourself. Yeah. We don't give you much of an option. Yeah. Right? We know that. Okay, so that's number one. So that puts you in this bind, right? So you need a community, so you're going to go to outside the Muslim community. Yeah. Hey, yeah, they'll accept you, right? In a sense.
I didn't want to do that either.
Right, but like, yes, that's what a lot of people do, right?
Exactly. You know, in the queer Muslim community, there is a lot of talk about like, I hate the white gays because they have no systemic analysis, but then I also can't hang out with Muslims because, you know, they're homophobic.
But like, how, I guess now the question is, but how do you reconcile, like, but it's like, okay, I don't know what Kugel's orientation is. Like, you know, he's probably done more than just write these books about homosexuality. He's probably got a dearth of scholar. So when I look at academics, and you can disagree on this, the way I look at academics is like academics in Islamic studies, is that I find their work interesting, but I look at it with a grain of salt because the establishment of academia does not like if you wrote a book, Heterosexuality in Islam, it would be boring. Yeah. Right? I mean, but, you know, it's like you're pushed to like kind of push the envelope a little bit, right? Yeah. I'm not saying that, you know, I would love to interview him at some point and like ask, you know, about that, because you know, when you look at the academics, you see them pushing things because they have to look at things from a different framework, right? But then there is issues where, like, as when we're Muslim, as they talk about Sunni orthodoxy, we look at, like, for example, the issue of patriarchy, right? We would say patriarchy is like how we look at that is a secular construct, and now we're interpreting the divine, or like we're interpreting essentially the infinite, right, through the finite, right, which is kind of has, you know, will lead us to, you know, issue. I mean, these are tools for sure, right?
For sure.
Like, for example, people use things like critical theory to like understand things and how the world works, but there's always, like, as Muslims, I think we always understand that, like, okay, Allah says and the Prophet says, and then now how do we understand that, right?
Right.
So, and you mentioned Ibn Hazm, and so Ibn Hazm is interesting because he's got that book called Atoko Hamama, like the Ring of the Dove, right? It's like, and it has like a lot of like homoerotic kind of stuff in there, right? And so there's like this whole like idea of like older men with young boys, and men, you know, there's this, it's as a desire, as recognized, right? However, Ibn Hazm also, I've seen referrals, things where he's saying but he's very clear as far as like, okay, but this is still that we don't do this. It's a desire that we talk about as far as like an illustration, but it's not. We're not going to allow this to be like, the only thing he allows is still male-female sexual intercourse. Right?
As far as I know, he did take that opinion, right?
Right.
He also said that the basis of using the story of Qawm Lut for that opinion was flawed because of that context, and so that's
Ibn Hazm. So
that's Ibn Hazm.
Yeah, but again,
he said, like, you can't use this text, you can't use this story to justify that.
So how does he would say that that the actual male anal, because like this specifically, you want to break it down. The story of Qawm Lut is man on man anal sex.
I would say rape, but
right, but that's what Ibn Hazm would say, right? Ibn Hazm wouldn't make the case for rape, like, and that's the thing. I'm like, I don't understand where Kugel is getting the narrations to like back up to say it's rape, because here's the thing: you could have a circle, right?
Yeah.
You could have like homosexual, you could have man on male anal sex, and within that, like a Venn diagram, you could still have rape. You could have you have male on male anal sex, and you have consensual as one part, and then they're both under it, right?
Right.
So I don't even.
Which is why I think Ibn Hazm says you can't extend that to like non-consensual sex, right? And I don't know if he uses the word non-consensual or consensual. I don't know what 14th century Arabic used, but that's specifically why, because that, like, consensual acts are not what happened in that story, and therefore you cannot use that to talk of a consensual act.
Right. But if he's got to come to the same conclusion that the other fuqaha have, as far as the permissibility, which is essentially the bottom line, then we have to understand, we have to question the consistency of using Ibn Hazm's argument. You understand what I'm saying?
I get that. No, I do get that. I also think that it's important to note that, like, the idea of what the Jama'ah considers, like the collection of Muslims, the body of scholars considers halal and haram, is also really, like, culturally defined. And that's something that I didn't really know, like, I didn't learn to push back on. Like, it made sense, but I was like, no, but like there's a divinity as well, and the idea of like what is agreed upon within the ulama. But like, there's another book actually that I read, Tripping with Allah by Dr. Michael Muhammad Knight. Very interesting read if you want to do it. But he talks about like this historical example of coffee, right?
Right.
Because coffee was new and shiny at one point, and there was a disagreement between the scholars of the time, and there was like a lot of heated, very like passionate arguments saying like, well, is coffee actually halal, right? Like there's like, I would say it wasn't majority, but I'd say it was like a very like almost 50-50 split, right? That he talks about, like being like, so many scholars were like, coffee is haram because it alters your mind, right? It covers your mind the same way that wine does. And then many were like, no, but the effect isn't the same as alcohol, right? And there's this very vigorous back and forth debate about like, is this actually halal or haram? And then eventually the Jama'ah decided that it was halal, but like what pushed it to that side was the fact that it was making the Ottoman Empire money. And so they were like, it's easier for us if this is halal, and so that is now something that is widely accepted as halal,
right,
and is never questioned, right?
Yeah. Let's talk about coffee. Let's talk about coffee. So like coffee, right? But what's the epistemological basis for coffee? It's a new thing, right? And I get it. There's a tendency when we see new stuff, it's haram, right? TV's haram, right? They're like, this is the job, right?
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Like, so they come across coffee. They might think it's an intoxicant, right? I think that's where maybe it came from. I don't know. Because remember smoking? Now smoking used to be like, when it first came out, it was like, well, it's makruh. The Azhar, the official fatwa from Azhar was it's makruh.
Right.
And then they realized that because of like bad breath and all that, the staining on clothing, but then they were like, well, no, emphysema ain't cool. So now I think most scholars would say it's impermissible, right? But coffee, again, I don't see where coffee has like, the reason the issue of anal sex is such a hot button, I think, is because it is now obviously Kugel has a different way of looking at a story of Prophet Lut, but the anal sex is still going down, whether it's rape or not, right? So it's now
I think that that distinguishment is important to make in terms of permissibility, personally, right? And based on what I've seen, I understand that is not something that like sort of the ulama have really talked about, and I think personally now, from where I stand, having gone through a lot of this growth phase and this social death phase, really, and losing a lot of my friends within the Muslim community, and therefore being really isolated. Like even now, if I wanted to learn Islamic finance, like if I did it with a mufti or something, they'd be like, what are you doing here? You know, like you're not even wearing a hijab, right? Or whatever it is, you know, like they'd be so confused and like turned off and put off, right? So that's just like even gatekeeping. If a trans girl wanted to become an alima, right, on that level, but I was gonna say something.
We're talking about the rape issue because because for Kugel
that's why there's a need for like what you would say progressive Muslim interpretations, right? Because they are pushing that envelope that is not being talked about in other in like the dominant spaces.
So there's a few things here. So back to let's talk about Kugel's point about. So for Kugel to insist that it's exclusively forced anal sex, forced rape, male on male, and that's limited to it, I feel like there isn't enough, like, I would want to know what his sources are. You understand what I'm saying? Like what, like, because for someone to come behind and just say, after 1,400 years or 1,000 years, whatever, however you want to look at the tradition, and say that, because unless he had some other backing from, like you said, Ibn Hazm has it, but then Ibn Hazm doesn't have the same conclusion, right? So, there's this thing that when you ever see these Muslim-Christian debates, you ever see these old Ahmadi, like, you know, you've seen these debates, right?
Oh, yeah.
And so sometimes the Muslims will, like, they'll quote the Bible when it's convenient, and then, like, they're like, but we don't believe that. We don't believe it's, like, it's called salad bar hermeneutics, right? What it is that you kind of, like, you use Ibn Hazm for one part, but you don't like understand its conclusion, right?
Yeah, I get that.
You get what I'm saying? So that's something I would explore at least. I mean, that's something we don't have to like. I mean, I haven't read Kugel's work, to be honest. So to be fair, you've read it. Listen, I'll give you that, but I think it's something that's something that needs to be like explored. Is what is the base for him to say that this is only rape? We're gonna have to need some basis for that. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah, and for me, the basis, like for me personally, the basis is the reality of the story, right?
Okay, but again, that's
that's not what the Sharia or like what the ulama establishment has taken from that story.
Exactly, because it's also like how much are you reading? Because I understand your experience, right?
Yeah,
and
that's sort of where I guess the Sufi bit comes into it, right?
Right, but even Sufism, right, has, if you like are in a tariqah, you have it through the because it's so
there is an Islam.
When we go outside of Sunni orthodoxy, anything can go, right? I think so.
I think every orthodoxy has their own anything goes, right? Sort of things, right? Because even in like, if you want to talk about Sharia,
right,
like there's an allowance for gender affirming surgeries, for example, for trans women and trans not really trans men yet, because that technology is not here, but definitely for trans women. But like, it is in a different context, right? It's basically sort of forcing gay men to be women, heterosexual women, sort of.
You know, that's interesting. You mentioned Shia Orthodoxy as well, because the way I try to frame we these kind of conversations where, so when we talk about, and I gotta define what we mean Sunni Orthodoxy real quick. So we talked earlier about your mom's outlook, having this like hardcore Salafi outlook, which is very restrictive, right? There's only like 10 scholars in the world that are legit, or something, maybe, I don't know. If you look at it. When I'm talking about like Sunni Orthodoxy, I'm looking at a very broad brush. You have like
with madahib and
the three schools of creed, like the Atharis, the Maturidis, and the Ash'aris, right? So you have and then which that means the Atharis, the people who follow, like they don't really delve into the how and what of God's attributes, and then the other schools are kind of use like Greek logic a little bit. And then you got the Sufis, the Sufic tariqas, the schools within it, like the different chain, but all of it with chains of narrative, sunnah, because that's essentially what the whole deal is like, how do you, for us to, we got to connect back to the Prophet, because that he's our source. So how do we connect back to that, right? So I think that's where it's like, in part of the madhab is like, that's why, like, so I follow Malik. I don't mix methodologies. I don't mix I don't take a Hanafi ruling. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah, I totally.
So I think if Kugel is really using Ibn Hazm for one part, but he's coming to a different conclusion, we need to understand why. It just can't be a thing. And if it becomes a thing of like, well, that's my Sufic nature, well, that also has to be. If you look at it through the lens of orthodoxy, we have to see it through that lens.
And so now I don't consider myself a Sunni Orthodox Muslim. Like I consider myself a Sunni Muslim who does not necessarily follow orthodoxy, right? But now that's where my journey has taken me. If at the time when I was still struggling with this, someone allowed me basically, or someone would have been a more kind, more like holding of that, meant like from an emotional state, but also like showing me a little bit of this leeway, right?
I mean, we fucked up.
Right. Absolutely.
You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
You know what I'm saying?
That, that's like a very like one-sided thing. Like it's clear.
Yeah.
But and I think that if that was sort of provided to me, that plus sort of like a framework that was not sort of like this very restricted one.
So right now you're already in this.
I would have potentially remained within the orthodoxy. Right. Like I can still see myself having done that. But now today, I don't. Like I still pray 5 times. I do all, Bunyan al-Islam ala khams. I do all 5, pillars of Islam and everything. No Hajj yet, but we'll see. But I'm also like very like proud and secure in my own self in terms of like what I believe and what I believe that Allah believes. Kind of. So that is where I'm at now. And that is not within the Sunni Orthodoxy, because I know that there's like some fine parts of that argument that we're having that are not easily
I get what you're saying, because I
know what I'm saying.
Yeah, so I think we're on the same page. I think that right now you're in this, you know, at the end of the day.
There's also, I guess, one point to talk about before I head on. There is also like this idea within the Orthodoxy of like deferring to like the medical complex. You know what I'm saying? Be like, oh, if a doctor says that you are intersex, then you're intersex and you're gonna have the surgery. Or if a doctor says this, it's a doctor's permission, right? So there's a deference to expertise. Right? But we also know that the medical industry is also influenced by academia and Western thought, right? And like whoever is in that, right? So all of these systems have biases built within them. Right. And who informs the medical industry about trans people? It's trans people. We have, if you will, the wahi, right? The direct experience of what it means to be trans, and we inform that, right? So, and then that is how the medical industry moves away from oppressive practices towards trans folks. And so I think that in that sense there is a case to be made also for like acceptance of like trans folks and also gay folks, you know what I'm saying, in terms of like if you think about it in that framework.
Sure. In light of, and my wife's a physician, so I understand. There's like this. There's the, and I want to get the trans for sure. There's that the transgender, that topic. But I remember you saying on the other show that like one thing, like I think what you want is you want out. You're not expecting like Sunni Orthodox Muslims to agree with you, but you want allyship.
I do really wish that there was solidarity.
Now what? Now, but like, so the way a Sunni Orthodox Muslim would to be like perfectly blunt would, because so when this issue of same sex, whatever you want to call it, like homosexual acts or what the act itself, we'd all say that okay, it's sinful, and people do it. That's fine. It's like any other sin, right? But if you now say it's, again, we talked about making permissible, changing God's law. The Sunni Orthodoxy would also be like, well, this is excommunication. This is grounds for excommunication, meaning that like we don't recognize this person's Islam, and Sunnis do recognize Shiites, like within the broad. I'm not talking like some of the Salafis probably would have a reason to like excommunicate the Shiites, right? But within the broad Sunni traditional sense, you're talking, they would also recognize the Shiites as part of Islam, as part of that family, right?
My dad is always the one who's been okay with Shias. My mom never liked Shias.
Right.
And now, sort of in defiance, I wear this Zulfiqar.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I think I saw that in Ertugrul. But like, so for example, let's take an example of Ahmadiyya, right?
Yeah.
Like Ahmadiyya, from the Sunni Orthodox point of view, their asl is that they're not Muslim, like their foundation, because you just can't have another prophet. Right. It's not like, so I'm trying hard to understand how you can expect allyship from a group that doesn't even believe you're a Muslim. Is it on a level? Do you acknowledge that, or is it like? Not saying you are specifically, but the ideology, because you can't make individual takfir.
Yeah.
Like that's another thing. Right. But it's something that, like, for example, I wouldn't be surprised. Like, I don't know, I haven't read Kugel's work,
if
right?
Someone would call me a kafir for
or
making
Kugel.
halal haram.
It wouldn't be. I don't think they would go to you specifically, like, yo, Ameer is a kafir.
They would say Kugel's work is.
Kugel, like, it would be like, it's kufr to believe it. Whether we, so there's the act. There's an act of kufr.
Yeah.
Right? To believe something that's outside that you're changing the law, that is considered kufr, right? But you can't make individual takfir. There's a process through that, right?
Yeah.
And all that. Kugel might say Kugel's a kafir because of how he frames it. Now, but again, that has to be discussed with him one-on-one. We don't know that.
Yeah.
You get what I'm saying?
But on like an intellectual ground, you would say that this idea is kufr.
Right. So like, it's hard for, like, one of the issues I see with like your desire for how.
I really don't see it. I didn't see it as kufr because I'm like, this is more accurate than the accuracy of the story that we're told in terms of like Qawm Lut, right? Like, this context is crucial and it's missing from people's analysis, right? When it comes to the talk of consent.
But I guess that's where it's essentially what you would be saying is that 1,400 years of scholarship is wrong. That's essentially. Are you okay with saying that though?
I would say
in favor of Scott Kugel, 1,400 years of scholarship is wrong.
I would say that in favor of Scott Kugel, yes, I would say that it's wrong, but it's also because of modern, like Western postmodernist, identities that we're even talking about this. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
So not of course to crap on any of those. They're visionaries, they're luminaries, right? Al-Ghazali and everyone who came up with all of this. Right. It is not something like the idea of consent was just not talked about within Sharia. Like from what I've understood, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But I think that it's a crucial part, right, of what makes a sexual act allowed or not. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
Like even in straight heterosexual, like with your wife. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
I'm envisioning that like without consent in my head, that's a sin, right?
I got you. I guess what I was asking is like, okay, your understanding is that you actually believe it, right? Okay, that's fine.
Yeah.
But I think when you're talking about Sunni Orthodox, because their framework is like, there's two things. Number one, they believe, they're not going to say you're a Catholic, but they're going to say that your belief is a kufr, right? And secondly, because of that, that's a deviated belief. And So why would we ally with someone who's corrupting our religion? Do you understand the thought process?
Yes, I would.
Yeah.
I get it, and I don't at this point really care much if someone would call me a kafir, you know what I'm saying?
Right.
But I think the allyship is really important.
Okay.
Because I've been
but I guess that's the question.
I've been called kafir tons of times,
Right.
honestly.
Yeah.
Right. So that's not a surprise to me.
Right.
But even if you disagree theologically with I don't know, your Christian community, your local Christian community, you're not going, like, you can say they're not Muslim clearly,
Right.
but you can still do like ikna, like Muslim Jewish day of service. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
You can still ally with them in other realms and in terms of like informing what your faith and spirituality looks like on a day-to-day basis, in terms of informing your like struggle against oppression, right? The Quran says all the time, you know, like Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu kunu qawwamina bil qist shuhada lillah, right? You know, be people who stand up firmly for justice, and Allah is your witness for that, right? And so there's so much oppression in this world of LGBTQ people, of black people, of, you know, trans women of color. I'm 25 in 5 months.
Yeah.
25 is the average life expectancy for a black trans woman in America.
Okay.
So I would be dead in less than a year.
Right.
If I lived average and I was African American, right?
Sure.
There's so much oppression systemically across the US that Sunni Muslims need to be a part of, right?
Right.
In St. Louis, there was actually this first like masjid to masjid protest that happened like last week, like Muslims marching for Black Lives, and it was really, really good to see. I mean, of course, the follow-up was really like not great, so it was just a march and everyone walks out and then they go back to their rich suburb houses.
Right.
But so like, even if you disagree with someone, you can work with them towards a belief that you believe is just, right? And justice for other people is working for all of us.
Right, exactly. So I think that definitely there should be, like, the humanity should always be respected first and foremost, right? So I think that we, as far as, like, if LGBTQ people are being, like, physically harmed, killed, these kind of things should be, like, that's something that should be, that we should, you know, I think everybody would agree that, okay, that's not cool. We should get behind that.
We also need to include fired, because fired is how you're also, because a job is how you're connected to
a job.
Insurance,
exactly.
and medical necessities.
Yeah. So because like, and again, it's like, it's the issue of like, you work at a corporation. Yeah. It's like your sexuality doesn't like affect how you work, right? Yeah. So it's different. Like,
it depends on how you're talking about it.
What it depends. What about like Islamic school? If you're, let's say,
I would just say, just making the argument that like, if you're a trans person, or if you're a person of color and all of your coworkers are white, then it does affect you. You know what I'm saying? If you're the only gay person, because then you're tokenized and you have all of this emotional labor that's put onto you. I mean, you're the diversity.
I mean, the kind of work. Like, if you're an engineer or a programmer, it doesn't like. But let's say now, if you're a religious figure, then that's different. And I'd be curious. Like, is there an issue with discriminating? Because like Muslims have a concern now that like, okay, well, jobs are fine, but now if it's an Islamic school where they're teaching my kids, then we should have a say. There should be a condition based upon who gets to teach at my school, right? So how would you? Because I think that goes back, because if we can't agree on like for to expect allyship first, there has to be like terms, right? There'll be terms like this is what we need, and then there's like almost like a negotiation of some type, like, hey, on the other side, like, okay, this is what we're willing to deal with, right? You know, so that's just some food of thought. In the way in my ideal world, as someone of Sunni Orthodoxy, my thing is, how I would have done it is like, we need to make our mosques more inclusive. So when people are going through what you're going through originally, we are able to, you know, bring, you know, not stigmatize, understand that this is a real human emotion that you're dealing with. That you're not that you didn't like pick this. It's something that like it's whatever. That's how I'm going to look at it, and we'll help you with that, and not like make you an outcast or a black sheep, right? And I think but I think there's going to have to be some fine fine tuning as far as, because I don't know that as someone who's Sunni and Orthodox, I could support like just like if it's okay, if there's trans people being killed, right? Definitely that's something I can get behind.
And what,
or if it's a job issue, right?
Yeah.
But if it's an issue of like, okay, well, we want to do a shared, like something of a, because even with Christians and the thing about Christians and Jews is that we have the Ahlul Kitab paradigm, right? So there is this kind of narrative, God tells us how to interact with the people of the book, right?
Yeah.
So there is like some basis to that. So because I just think it's a hard sell. But anyways, I don't want to keep going on that. I want to hear about you come out as gay officially in college. Talk to me about this being trans
also in college.
College. So what's going on there? What's the mindset like? You like men as a male, but then why is it like? I guess what's going on in your just walk me through it. I guess I'm really interested in understanding this side.
My junior year, I became an RA, which was very important for me because then I was able to live on campus instead of commute, and so I didn't have to sort of fend off with my parents' sort of emotional labor and like their grieving process, right? And I could focus on my studies and like
the grieving process, meaning you're coming out.
Yes, their grieving process for my coming out.
Okay,
which is still happening. Every now and then.
What is like the initial reaction? What the fuck? Let me.
They didn't believe it at first. They were like, "We're just glad you're not atheist," because that was the outcome of that LSD trip. But eventually they're like, "Wait, you're not really serious about this, are you?" I'm like, "Yeah, I'm quite serious." And they're like, well, what about this? Well, what about Qawmi? Well, what about this? And I'm like, I've already gone through all of this, right, in my head, and I know what I believe, and I don't feel like walking you through that necessarily if you're not open to, like, actually listening, right? You're just taking out your emotional world on me. You're not really listening to the arguments or anything here.
Yeah.
So,
now, as a parent, though, because I've seen our first generation parents, how they don't handle it, right?
Right.
It's almost like expected. Our parents freak out about much less serious things. Like, I remember when I was a kid, girl says hi to me like middle school. Dad would freak out like, hey, who's that?
Oh yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Still do.
Like, you know what I'm saying? So like, I think it's part of the, I guess, maturation.
Yeah.
Again,
so grieving process still.
You know what I'm saying? So I think that's something that we have to deal with. So that's something I think about. I think about 3 girls, and I was like, if one of them, it crossed my mind, if one of them, tells me that, they're same-sex inclined at some point, then how would I, handle that? I would like to think I would, handle it appropriately, whatever that means, right? Or also better than my parents would, right?
Yeah, for sure. It's also important to note there's, really no precedence in talking about Sharia, about vagina to vagina, sexuality, right?
Right. Well, because there's no penetration.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
well, you have to use, you can't use a body, there's no body part to body,
there's obviously, a level of, it's you can, I don't know if you can call it intercourse, but it's sex between one. Hey.
Yeah.
Right, and that is, the ruling for that, liwat, I think was what it's called, is literally just borrowed from the logic for same-sex male acts, and it's really it even Ibn Hazm also says that that's really sloppy, just in terms of
so the rationale for the verses of Qawmi Lut can't be, as I believe, you don't extrapolate lesbianism from that,
right?
There's other that's another topic, by the way. I don't want to get there, but so then you're the trend. So talk me through the trans I guess. Okay, first of all, I guess trans isn't a monolith either, right? Being transgender, it's not a monolith. There's a spectrum. Is that the right way to say it? So, it means something different or different.
Which are we talking about first? Parents or trans?
Okay, finish parents. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
Grieving process, but I was able to be an RA, so I was able to leave that and save myself from being the scapegoat of all of their emotional labor in that sense, or emotional whatever they're going through. As an RA, my boss was also a queer person, and so he was able to provide like a level of like support and acceptance I've never had in my life, because I'm always fighting to be myself, and I was like, wow, I don't have to fight. Like, what is this? This is so weird. It's uneasy. It's making me uneasy to not have to justify my existence, kind of. But then that's like during that time, I was like, I've done a lot of work regarding like I guess learning and empathizing with gay folks. I've done a lot of work with empathizing with black folks. I haven't done a lot of work with like learning about patriarchy, right? So I'm going to do an experiment in empathy. And my experiment in empathy was that I wore feminine clothes for like a couple of months at the end of the semester, right? Because I was watching all of these folks, and I was like, okay, like I get like oppression of women happens. I also get that I will never know what that looks like because I'm not a woman. And then I was also like looking at experiences of trans folks and also trying to empathize with them. And then I was like, okay, maybe I can not kind of a kill two birds with one stone, but like do this experiment to be like, how do these people feel and how can I really try to empathize with them? So I started wearing feminine clothes near the end of that semester. And I essentially realized it fit me too well. And I was like, wait, am I trans? No, I'm not trans, right? And I'm like trying it out and I'm just like, this is like, I feel more comfortable in this than I ever imagined I would. And this is also making me lose friends in the MSA, right? Which I'm still like affiliated with at this point. But I'm doing it because I want to like push myself to experience and feel that empathy. Even if it bites. So I was like, okay, I'm going to try using she, her pronouns now for a little bit, right? So that was my 2017 New Year's resolution. It's the only New Year's resolution I've kept. And I kept doing that as an experiment, and I was like, but this feels too like I hit the nail on the head and I didn't mean to, right?
I get what you're saying,
And so I was like thinking about this and like talking through this with like folks who were queer and trans and knew that experience, and I was like, yeah, I think that's actually what's happening here. I think I'm a trans woman. So
gotcha.
So that was sort of another like
So now I guess because we talked a little, like my wife's a physician, right? So like sometimes people come in and they have like the biological, like there's like the way the chromosomes are wired. There is like some of that like biologically, right?
Yeah, if you're talking about intersects, right?
Is maybe in that sense, right? I guess at this point, so by the way, at this point, I assume you're like looking at Islam too from a different lens. Like originally you were looking at it from the Sunni Orthodox lens, and the Kuhl's book comes, and then it's like, so I'm trying to as we're trying to map the parallels, the paths, so to speak.
Still definitely, even today, most of my understanding is informed through a Sunni Orthodox lens.
Right. Sure.
But I take inspiration and guidance from other places now as well.
Okay. So now when you start doing so I guess that's what I want to explain a little bit to the folks is like what like this the spectrum. That's what I mean by spectrum. Is that an appropriate way to say that it's
so I want to start off with saying that this is the Western 2020 notion of gender, right? And that gender is a spectrum from male to female. Folks who fall in between may identify as either, both, non-binary, whatever, right? And there are folks who also feel like they're outside of that spectrum, right? Like, and they might identify as a gender, right? I just don't have a gender.
Right.
Like, and so like these are all things, and pronouns are like sort of go hand in hand with that, but it's quite common and not considered rude to just like ask someone like, what pronouns do you use, if any, sort of thing.
Okay.
Right. And so now I go to a masjid that actually does, like, it is very LGBTQ affirming.
You get like
the masjid I attend now is virtual, but it's very LGBTQ affirming. And when people are introducing themselves, like from around the world, they're like, "Oh, this is my name. I am based in St. Louis, Missouri, and I don't use pronouns, or my pronouns are she, hers, or they, them, or whatever it is," right? So it's very much like you can ask someone their pronouns without thinking you're rude. So
you're allowed to.
Yes,
so you
yes.
should. Okay.
You should.
Okay. I got you.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
It's like, do you use pronouns, or what pronouns do you use? Right? It's something like that.
Right. So what's this? So
this is the 2020 modern conception of Western conception of gender. Right.
Right.
Now, historically, there have always been folks that have existed outside of this gender binary that colonialism and white supremacy has imposed on us. Mm-hmm. So you can talk about indigenous North Americans, right? Who existed with like 5 genders, right? Like a man, like a male, feminine male, like masculine, female, and like what is now called two-spirit, right? Mm-hmm. It's kind of like that gender in between. In the Indian subcontinent, in Bangladesh, where we come from, there's obviously hijras, right? Who have always existed sort of outside of that gender binary of man and woman, right? In other parts of the world, like Indonesia, right? There's on the island of Sulawesi specifically, there's like, I believe, the Bisu, not, there's just one Bisu. Who are also trans women, and who incidentally, I think they're trans women. We would call them trans women if we're imposing a Western view of gender onto their view of gender, which is different, right? Okay. But they're my fun fact that I learned reading about them is that actually they were the leaders of their communities. Yep. And that they are the reason why Indonesia has so many converts to Islam, because they converted to Islam, right? As trans people who led their communities, and then their communities also led Islam. So like everyone is like, Indonesia is the most heavily populated like Muslim country in the world. I'm like, you have trans people to thank for that. Yeah. As far as like historically, like people who fall outside the traditional male-female gender binary, would you say that it was biologically that they just fell outside of the spectrum, or because, so for example, now what you hear now is like there's hormone therapy and procedures, but that, as far as I understand from a layman, that stuff is relatively new. The procedures are typically it's part of it's medical. It's industry. More modern. It's more modern, like the procedures. Yeah. So, but if there's a natural phenomenon, with it that we've established through history, right? Is that purely biological, in terms of like how it manifests, or is that also like a psychological aspect to that? Is that kind of what you're asking? No, it's more like, well, however that manifested, it like had a natural course. Yeah. Meaning that like 500 years ago, wherever, if that there's people. But like, what is natural, right? That's what I guess I want to ask about. If in natural, does that mean like at birth you see that someone has both sexual organs? Is that when you determine that is made, or is natural being when they grow up and they are more drawn to like effeminate pursuits and then begin identifying with femininity? You know, like even though they were assigned male at birth, like. Both of those, in my opinion, are natural, right? Absolutely. And both of those have been seen in different situations in different, like, communities, right? I guess what I'm asking is, your second example, right? They think you're a girl or a boy, and then you're growing up and you're actually not, right? But there's no, like, there's idea of like there's no hormone therapy 400 years ago. Yeah, you get what I'm saying? Yeah. So how do you reconcile? Because now that's where a lot of the controversy seems to be these days, is that people would say, well, if it's you talked about like the infrastructure of medicine. Yeah. It's like there's people who have other interests who are invested financially, for example, in trans surgeries or hormone therapy, etc. For sure. Which sometimes can have adverse effects. Like it's like medication in a way if you don't prescribe it the right way. But like if you like, why wouldn't we just let the folks who had that natural inclination let them evolve in the way they are going to be,
rather than using like hormones or like procedures, etc.
Yeah, most folks who go on to medications or those are not forced into it, you know, from my understanding, right? For me, it was a very hard decision to actually start hormone replacement therapy, which I have been on now for 2 years or so.
Right.
That was a hard decision because I am also very skeptical of the pharmaceutical industry, and I'm just like, I don't want to put shit in my body that is gonna, you know, make me, you know, fucked up somehow. Like, I don't want to do that.
Right.
But like, I thought about it really, really hard for a long time, and I basically decided that's the thing, right? No one should be forced to transition if they do not want to, right? In any way, right? So I decided that for me personally, it was best that I actually go on hormone replacement therapy for my mental health, so that I can align with what my gender is, right? And because I had the means to, I had Medicaid, because Medicare is the one for old people.
I guess what I'm really asking is like, yeah, it's so
it is a personal decision.
You know, it's a personal decision, but like, did you think about like, well, you mentioned you don't trust what the industry is about, right? There's reason to distrust that,
yes.
Right? So is it something that did you ever think about like, let me just do it, like, okay, if I am a trans woman,
yeah,
then I'm just gonna live my life as a trans woman without hormone therapy.
Yeah, I did that for a little bit. I did that for like a very long time, actually, like 1.5 years.
You know, right? But like now, do you think about like 10 years from now if you want to become a trans man again? That does happen, right?
It would be a cisgendered man at that point.
Cisgendered?
Cisgendered man. Cisgendered being the opposite of transgendered, right? Because there are stories of people who detransition. It's a very low percentage of trans folks. And I believe 95% of those who do detransition are like coerced into it somehow, right? Because of like familiar pressure or like job pressure or other sorts of pressures, right? Only like 5% of them actually do that willingly, like out of their own volition. But in the case that does happen, yeah, I was scared. That's why I didn't want to go on hormones, right? Because I was like, what if? What if it's not for me? You know?
Yeah.
So it was a hard decision for me to make.
Right. What was I going to say? Actually, because I know someone who's he identifies as a trans male.
Okay.
But I didn't know what that meant.
Okay.
Really?
Typically, when I hear that,
But he did say. I found out later, before, like a couple years ago, that he identified as a female, and he had a female name.
Okay.
You know, so now, but he was a male originally.
Okay.
You know what I'm saying? So it's like he did a stint, but he calls himself a trans man today.
Okay.
You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So that's what I was thinking. Now,
yeah,
I see what you're saying. It's a little
at that point, it's like sort of personal preference, right?
This is all yeah. Because I think he still like, I guess, wants to align with the community, but you know, it's interesting.
I see that.
You know. All right, I'm gonna ask you like a real. So you've done the hormone therapy. Have you done the surgery? Have you, or
did you get the surgery? It's always the question that trans folks get, and it gets obtuse if you're not willing to share that. I'm obviously sitting here on this podcast willing to share, which is why I'm talking. I haven't, and I don't know if I want to.
Okay.
Yeah, and that, like, there are obviously different surgeries, like, right, it's always like bottom surgery, people talk about top surgery is also like breast augmentation is a thing that happens,
right?
There's also like facial feminization therapy, right? So like bone structure and everything, adjusting that. There's like tracheal scraping to like have folks have like higher pitched voices, right? None of those really appeal to me or are things that I feel necessary for me. Right. So I don't do them. Right. And asking that is like usually considered rude because it's like, what do you need to know what's in someone's pants for, right? Yeah. Right. I get what you say. It's and then I guess you mentioned are you open to talk about relationships? Yeah. Like as far as like how do you view like relationships now? Like versus like as far as like, okay, so as a trans female,
because you originally the story I guess started with
liking men.
Liking men.
Yeah.
So is that still the case? Is that, or how's that evolved?
That's evolved.
Okay.
Into sort of a bisexuality.
Okay.
Of sorts. It's evolved into me understanding that I'm more sort of sexually, physically attracted to folks who are male or assigned male at birth, and then more romantically attracted to folks who are femme, right? So female, non-binary, trans women, that sort of
Sure.
crowd. So that's sort of what it has evolved into now. And I don't blame myself for getting it wrong the first time, because that's an easy trap to fall into, I feel like. Because again, coming out is a continual process, right? And it's like, it's essentially a journey of humanity, of finding who you are, right? It's like the very typical self-discovery journey story.
Yeah.
Different.
With people now, I've heard some people say that, like, if you're gonna get surgery done, that they say you should see a psychologist first, or people. Do you agree with that, like, segment? Because we talked about, I think we briefly talked about therapy earlier, right? Is that something you would, if someone wanted to? Because when you do hormone therapy, there's always you can always, I guess, kind of go back. But if you do the surgery, it's harder, right?
It's more permanent of an operation, yeah. I think that in an ideal world, yes, you would go to a psychologist or a therapist or something.
Right.
Someone who is not actively trying to talk you out of it, right? Someone who is really trying to sit with you and be like, what are your needs, and does this fill your needs, right? In an ideal world, yes. I think also the fact is that we do not live in an ideal world, and that most trans people are disproportionately without jobs, fired from jobs, therefore have no access to healthcare. And if they're also on, like, living paycheck to paycheck, they cannot afford a psychologist or a therapist to give them a formal diagnosis so that they can take that and get the operation that they need, right?
Right.
So I think because of, again, the oppression within the structure of the medical industry,
right,
that is not a feasible ask for everyone.
Okay, cool. Last question before we wrap up here. Like, your other extended family, right? You're here visiting family. Yeah. How has that relationship been for you since, I know it's been quite a journey, right?
Yeah. It's interesting because, like, I can't really hide who I am as a trans woman, right? I show up and I'm like, this is me, no one can.
I honestly didn't. I wasn't sure, because I know I saw your Facebook. We're Facebook friends, so I saw you have your makeup and your earrings and everything, right? And I was like, but she's visiting her uncle in Chicago, which I assume. I'm gonna assume he's probably not just hunky. It's not just hunky dory for him.
No, it's not.
You know what I'm saying?
He definitely had a point where he kind of let loose about his, like, feelings about it, and it was, like, really hurtful.
Right.
But then since then, he's kind of done a 180, and he's not supportive, but he gives me a basic form of respect. And for me, again, I'm still someone who really treasures, like, Islam and silatul rahim, right? Taking care of, like, extended family and like maintaining those ties of kinship is more important to me than being respected, which is kind of a really tough, like, it's a rock and a hard place, honestly, right? To be like, I'm getting disrespected, but I'm still going to respect you because when they go low, I go high, or whatever, and however tiring that gets after, after ages.
Right.
I found in general that Bengalis, compared to, like, Indians or Pakistanis or Arabs, have been a lot more open and accepting of me. I don't know if that's because I'm Bengali or because, like, maybe Salafism has less of a root in Bengalis than it does in Pakistanis in the US. I have no idea, but, like, from my personal experience, all the Bengalis have been a lot more chill with it than other folks.
I think it's because what we talked about at the very beginning, like, our parents came over here for education, right?
Yeah.
There's more, like, if you look at the demographics of Bangladesh, even if you look at Islam in Bangladesh, when's the last time you went to Bangladesh?
A couple of years back.
Okay. As a trans female?
I was a closeted trans female, so I definitely tried to keep everything down, even though I had like growing breasts and shit. But like, yeah.
Okay, so like the way I look at how it's practiced there, it's like usually you don't have much in the middle. You got your extreme like mullah subs, and then you got like who are like far everything like pictures of haram and everything, right? And then you've got like secularists, right? And I think a lot of times, like when I look at my dad's friends group, and it's like, you know, the kids I grew up with, it seems like it's a lot of, so it's a different, their outlook on religion is like a little, I would say, more secular, I would say, to be perfectly frank. That you couldn't, so that's maybe that's the reason. Who knows?
I don't even think so. There's even like plenty of religious Bengalis who are just like better with it than.
As far as like having like, I think it's also like a maturation. So I think at the end of the day, like what's got to be clear is, from my point of view, is like, listen, like we can obviously I gotta have mad respect. You have the Qu'ran memorized, right? And that's something that like having the book of God in your heart is something that, you know, takes work, and that's something. Obviously, I would like you could, if you know, I have to disagree with how the things you know, how you're living your life, etc. Now, however, understanding that there are there are also reasons there, and there's things that we the community have to do better at, and we all have our own struggles, right? You know what I'm saying? I mean, like, let me ask you a question as we wrap up here. I'm a married man. Based, like, would it be? Do you think it'd be like? Because the thing is, we struggle. We all have, even as a married guy, we have struggles. We have like you still, you know. And it's not. I don't want to reopen that door again, but it's this idea of like we all want to, you know, engage in stuff that we probably shouldn't, right? And you know, when you, from your lens, not Sunni or not like have how you understand religion today, would you be okay with a guy like me who's married, like having sex with other women because like my wife isn't giving me what I want? Like, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would say that needs to be consensual. Otherwise, you're going behind someone's back, and that's deception. And war is deception, as the Prophet said, not a loving relationship, right?
So it has to what like consensual, like she agrees to it.
In my opinion, now, right, me as a heathen, I guess, if you will, who is strayed from the orthodoxy path, I would say that if it is, that if she is okay with it, then that's an open relationship, and that's allowed, right? In the same way that sort of marrying more than one wife is allowed, right? Though of course, like this is also because I look at committed relationships outside of marriage as fulfilling all of the obligations or sort of Sharia injunctions that nikah fulfills, right? Except without the paperwork and the official ceremony, right? So I'm okay with extramarital sex if it's committed, right? And so I'm like, if it's also consensual here, I'm okay. On a personal level, I have no objections to it, right? I'm not telling anyone to believe what I believe, right? Right, yeah. But
well, hey, Ameer, I really appreciate you coming on, being very frank and having this conversation because, you know, it's something that I was nervous about having this conversation. I don't know how you felt coming on. Like, it's not necessarily a Muslim platform, but I am kind of a public figure in the Muslim Orthodox world with the Mad Mamluks podcast that you guys can subscribe to. By the way, if you haven't canceled me yet after the show, right? You know, that's the thing, and I know that there's going to be flack from people who, without even listening to this episode, are going to be like, Maheen he's a sellout, this and that, right? And I'm like, well, I mean, you should listen to the show. So that does enter my mind, but at the end of the day, my show is really to understand, like, it's not really to debate people, it's to like understand why people believe what they believe, right? And I really thank you for coming on and really like letting me dig in a little bit and extract some stuff. I don't know if you have ever done an interview like this that was like.
No, we got nitty gritty, yo. I was like, I'm tired now.
You told me you had no time limit, so I was like, all right.
Yeah, no, it was all right.
We're going on almost 2 hours, so all right. Okay. With that being said, make sure you subscribe to the channel on Apple Podcasts, Pocket Casts, wherever you listen to shows. And this the video version of this will be up on YouTube.
Should I plug my social media too?
Sure, if you got something. Sure.
At Bengal Brony on Instagram,
Okay.
Twitter. I don't really use Twitter that much. Don't follow me on Twitter.
Right.
Facebook.
Right, absolutely. All right, so for our special guest, Ameera Khan, right? I'm your host, Mahin Islam, signing off for Sultan Sneakers. All right, real quick, an outro, just so we can wrap this up. Thanks for viewing the episode today. As always, I don't agree with all the viewpoints of my guests. That should be known, but I feel like I got to make that extra disclaimer this time around. Specifically, I disagree with the guests justifying same-sex behavior and justifying the way they transitioned, okay? I don't believe there's a place in Islam for that. I do not agree with Scott Kugel's methodology. I think I pointed that out in the podcast, so I wanted to reiterate that again. And I do want to say that there is, I do have sympathy or some empathy for Ameera because same-sex inclination is something that's stigmatized so heavily, even if there's not a sin associated with it, right? So let me clarify. Same-sex inclination without an act is not a sin, okay? It's something that people deal with. It's something that some of y'all may not agree, but it's a natural inclination. People have different inclinations, right? We are judged upon how we act upon our feelings, okay? But when a feeling that's not a sin is stigmatized so much that it feels like more than other sins, then we have a problem. That doesn't justify someone's actions after the fact, right? But we have to keep that in mind. I think that's something that, as a community, as we mature, we got to work on that. It's not an easy situation. I don't think we're there yet. But I think these kind of conversations hopefully will highlight to us, what can happen when we don't have the right process, the right systems, the right mentality, the right mindset in place. So that's all I've got. If you have any comments, you can email me at info@sultansneakers.com or just comment below on the bottom of the YouTube channel. Like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.